I'm Kelly Hyman, and welcome to Unresolved, the Diddy cases. Joining me now, Alyse Adamson, former Assistant U.S. Attorney. Alyse, thank you so much for taking the time today and joining us. What is the most interesting testimony that you've heard in the Diddy case?
That's such a hard question because this case has had explosive testimony. And a lot of it has been interesting for two different reasons. Obviously, there's testimony that's legally significant, and then there's testimony that really describes a lifestyle that those of us on the outside are unfamiliar with. I think some of the most interesting testimony I heard was the Mia testimony. And that's because the testimony of Cassie Ventura, who really is the lead complaint, the lead victim in this case, there was a second victim, Jane. We can discuss that later. But it's really Cassie Ventura's account of events, what led to this investigation and ultimately these charges. So we knew a lot about what Cassie was going to say, but it was Mia. She's also considered a victim, but not charged with respect to the sex trafficking. And she was a former assistant of Combs. And what she described was probably the most toxic, abusive, and quite frankly, illegal work environments that I have ever heard of. She testified to not being able to leave Combs's house, having to live on his property, having her door locked, essentially being a prisoner, working something like 24 hours a day and being forced to consume and distribute narcotics. I knew things were bad when I read the indictment and also some of the civil lawsuits, but that testimony to me really blew the lid off of what this Combs enterprise really is, if the testimony is believed by the finder of fact, of course.
So, talking about Mia's testimony, and maybe you can go into more depth about it. We talk about a predicate act about the forced labor. Do you think, based on Mia's testimony, that that helps substantiate the RICO charge against Diddy?
Sure. So I think Mia's testimony helped with respect to the charges in a few ways. They all go to the RICO charge, to be clear. It's that first charge of RICO. I think she helped establish that criminal enterprise, number one, because she worked for Diddy and the things she was doing were illegal. So there was testimony that there was drugs involved and that she would at time distribute these narcotics or be one of the folks that had to dole out the drugs, right? So not only is that one of the predicate acts, so and you said, and I'm sure you've explained many times, that to prove a RICO, the jury unanimously has to find two predicate acts. The government has presented something like 10. Recently, they have decided not to go forward on two of those predicate acts, being arson and kidnapping, but drug distribution certainly is one of them. And Mia testified about drugs. She testified about the operation of this organization that she was employed in and her piece in that. And remember, the government has to prove that there was a factual corrupt enterprise. So that's one way Mia's testimony helped. Like, she was being used in ways you wouldn't usually use an employee, this unified purpose, and it didn't seem to be advancing legitimate business interests, seemed to be advancing crimes. But then to your point, specifically forced labor, that's another predicate act. And I think the testimony that the government elicited with respect to Mia definitely has established forced labor. She had to work 24 hours a day. As I said before, she was not allowed to leave her room. If you look at the elements of forced labor, her testimony, again, if the jury credits the entirety of it, definitely establishes that. And that's one of those predicate acts. And I do think because her testimony was so strong, the jury could easily find unanimously that that happened, right? Like, there wasn't a ton of cross that was aimed at that particular point. There was a lot about the voluntariness of her role in the organization, whether or not she liked Combs, but as a factual issue, like, did she work 24 hours a day? Don't think that the defense was able to adequately rebut that, and the fact that she did not want to do that. So I think forced labor is a pretty strong predicate offense that the government is advancing toward the jury.
In regard to the RICO charge, do you think that the prosecution has proved that charge beyond a reasonable doubt?
Kelly, this is really tough, and this is something I've struggled with. I think, and this is the legal answer, right? This is the lawyerly answer. I think a reasonable juror could conclude that the government has proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt if that juror credits all of the testimony that has been presented to them, right? It's a sufficiency question. Is the evidence sufficient to sustain a conviction? So if he's convicted, if it goes up on appeal, do I think it would be upheld? On those grounds, yes. Okay. I think the government proved their case in a very technical manner. They methodically brought out the evidence that was necessary to build their RICO case. I think if you credit all this testimony, I do believe they have been able to demonstrate there is a corrupt enterprise. In fact, it's Combs' multiple organizations. It's Combs employing these people in his personal capacity, but they're all kind of acting as a corrupt enterprise. That's how it was charged, right? They didn't charge bad boy enterprises. They charged a Combs enterprise, which is made up of all of his various enterprises and himself, working as a de facto organization with a unified purpose. And the unified purpose is illegal activities. You know, the most important purpose obviously being satisfying his sexual gratification needs through the sex trafficking. So I think if the jury credits every single thing they heard, yes. But then the bigger question is, will the jury do that with the effective cross we saw from this? I think they said it was a $10 million criminal defense team.
So let me give you a little pushback on the RICO charge. What about the argument that there was no meetings of the mind? What would you say to that? What would be your counter argument to since there is a alleged conspiracy, that there was no actual meeting of the minds, go to the defense argument that there was no RICO?
Well, I think this is a technical point. Again, I think RICO conspiracy is different than an ordinary conspiracy. And this is where we get in the legal weeds, right? In an ordinary criminal conspiracy, we think about an object of a conspiracy. There are all of these overt acts that the government must prove to prove a conspiracy. And so the meetings of the mind, it's legally a little bit different than in a RICO conspiracy, where the folks need to be operating under a unified purpose. That's different than the object of the conspiracy. So what their minds need to be meeting about, right, is a unified purpose. So are they all in agreement that they're doing this thing for a reason? And I think one of the reasons the government advanced in the indictment is for the sexual gratification of Combs, and also to protect Combs's reputation. I think you did hear that there was a meeting of the minds. These employees cared about Combs, and they were doing these things because it was their job, and they wanted to do their job well, and they wanted to take care of their boss. So I think that's the government's theory. They were meeting their mind for the unified purpose. Then with these predicate acts, again, what do we mean when we're talking about entering into this agreement? They were definitely knew what they were doing with respect to distributing drugs, for instance. You heard testimony about walking around with a fanny pack fully loaded that they knew they were going to give to people. So the agreement there was, yes, I am going to distribute these drugs. I don't think you need to agree to be in a RICO conspiracy, but you do need to agree that you are doing these things. And then with the predicate acts, you are agreeing to do the predicate act, which is why I think the government couldn't prove the arson, for instance, because there wasn't enough evidence that Combs himself was a participant. They didn't make the link that there was conversation or there was that tacit agreement. Some of these other things through text messages, through the testimony of the witnesses about what the directions were. I think the argument is, Kelly, that there were conversations and his low-level employees knew what they were doing. Now, then the question is, Did they do it willingly, right? Because we talk about coercion, that's a different question. But when it comes to, did people talk to one another and agree to do the things, I do think there is enough evidence that the government can argue that they did. But your pushback is correct, and that's exactly what the defense is going to say. I never said it was strong. I said technically I think it's there.
As a former U.S. attorney, is it normal for the prosecution to drop charges, the alleged arson, the alleged conspiracy? And if so, why did they do it and what was the reasoning behind it?
So I won't say that it's particularly common, but it's not unusual in a trial for the government to streamline certain theories based on how the evidence came out, right? Because to that point, the government's only really seen a one-sided case. You present a case to a grand jury, the defense isn't there to cross, you bring your witnesses in to talk, it's your side, you think you know how the witnesses are going to hold up on cross, you prepare them, but you never really know. So I think when you have a complicated case like this, I mean, to the point of our conversation, right? Where you have to get really in the legal weeds, really technical on how the government thinks they're going to get there. Why cause further confusion if the evidence didn't come in a strong way? So I think what happened is the government got together. I think there's something like 6 AUSAs on this case, and they thought, well, we didn't really have it, or if we have it, it's too complicated to explain in closing, and you don't want to do that at this stage. What the government needs to do, is to be able to present a narrative, a story that a jury can understand. And so if you have a story that's become confusing, if you are able to streamline that story and make it less confusing and really just argue the strongest points of your case, you should do that. And so, yes, I have seen it, but you always hope that the case you're bringing to trial is the case that you're going to ultimately hand to the jury, right? So it happens sometimes. It's a tactical decision. And I think here, understanding some of the weaknesses in their case, the government made a decision to go ahead with the stronger predicate acts.
Is the case that they brought to trial the same case that they're ending the trial with?
Yes, I think is the very short answer. The theory of the case has not changed. I think, go ahead. Sorry,
No, go
Kelly.
ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think the short answer is yes, but there's a lot of nuance there. I think the theory of the case hasn't changed, that this is coercive conduct, that what happened to these women, and I'm talking specifically to the sex trafficking charge right now, we'll return to the RICO, but what happened to these women was changed at some point from voluntary relationship into coercive situation, that Combs essentially groomed these women by promises of a relationship and then use them to fulfill his own sexual gratification, really against their will at a certain point. That was the narrative, that this was coercion. The defense obviously is saying, no, this was all consent. Those are the dual themes. So we're still going to hear that it is coercive. I think that the way the government opened necessarily is going to have to be different from how the government closes, because the way the evidence came in, at least in my opinion, from what I've read in the transcripts and the reporting, was not as strong as it sounded like it would be, the way it was set up in the opening. And as you know, that's why you have to never overpromise in an opening, because then defense can say, do you remember what you heard at the beginning of the case? That was the first and last time you heard it, because none of that was presented to you in 7 weeks. So I think the government has a harder job really contextualizing a very nuanced situation and saying two things can be true, because a lot of these witnesses and victims had conflicting motivations. You can want to be with somebody and you can be benefiting from a relationship and still have the right to say no and still feel coerced. And those are really, really hard concepts for people who have never been in those situations to understand. So the government has their work cut out for them, for sure.
Do you think the government has proven its case in regards to the 2 sex trafficking charges?
So again, I think if the jury was to sit and believe every word that came out of Cassie Ventura and Jane's mouth, when they said, because if you say I was coerced, I didn't want to do it, and I felt like I had to do it, or else something bad would happen to me. Legally, that's enough. I felt coerced through his force. I was afraid he was going to hurt me if I didn't do this. That's what you need. But I think the defense did a very good job drawing out various instances of these women not being threatened, especially Jane, the more recent victim, of them not being forced by violence or Combs not even being in the area, and they proactively, especially as to Jane, and let's just speak as to Jane, proactively setting up these freak offs because it seemed like Jane as a witness, her motivation was really to love Combs and to spend more time with him. And so it was more internal pressure because she wanted to please her romantic partner than it was actual coercion. The government, of course, has advanced a theory that Combs wielded a lot of economic control over Jane at that time. And if she did not participate, that she was going to lose her home and some of her other income because she had left her life as an influencer to be in a relationship with him. That is the government's theory. And of course, the defense has come back and injected doubt in that by saying, well, Jane was free to leave and look at all these text messages. She was still wanting to do this just to please her man. So again, if the jury were to believe Jane when she says, all that's true, but I really felt like I didn't have a choice, maybe. But from what I heard, and the caveat is I have not been in the courtroom, so I have not heard every single word, and I have not had an opportunity to observe the jury, and that is very important when we are making assessments. But I think the evidence as to Jane, at least, Cassie is a little bit of a more complicated story, is weak. And so on a technical points, do I think that they may have proved their case? Perhaps. I think it's going to be very hard for a jury to convict based on everything that we've heard, because I think there's reasonable doubt there all day.
And do you think there's reasonable doubt in regards to just Jane, or do you think there's reasonable doubt in regards to Jane and Cassidy, both ex-girlfriends of Diddy, which help potentially substantiate the sex trafficking charge?
Yeah, I think there's more doubt as to Jane. I think the record there is a lot clearer of how conflicted she was about how much she wanted to be with Combs, how much she cared about Combs. She's also older and she was more financially independent. I think that really matters. With Cassie, she met Combs when she was a teenager. So I think this idea, the story that she was groomed and didn't have a way out would resonate more with a jury because she really came up in that relationship. I think they got together when she was in her early 20s and he already controlled her career. And there was a lot more violence. There was violence as to Jane for sure. But with Cassie, Cassie described an instance of rape. Cassie described brutal beatings, which were then corroborated by multiple witnesses. I think it was Dawn Rashad who testified coming over to their house and watching Combs attack Cassie with a frying pan and pull her up the stairs with her hair. And who can forget the 2016 Intercontinental security camera video of Combs brutalizing Cassie. So I don't think that there could possibly be a doubt in the jury's mind that that woman was scared of Combs. And so seeing the violence firsthand, and I think the video, by the way, it was much stronger than any freak off video. Obviously, the freak off videos are sealed. The media has not been allowed to see it. So who knows what's on those videos really. But when you have a video of a grown man beating a woman the way that we saw, there really is not a counter narrative to that, which is why the defense was forced to say, our client is a domestic abuser. Yes, our client is a bad person. And if he was being charged with that crime, we wouldn't be going to trial. The inference being he would be pleading guilty because he's guilty all day. So they had to make that concession because there was no way to cast doubt on that. The doubt they're trying to cast is whether or not, just like as to Jane, whether or not she was consenting or being coerced. And they're saying Cassie financially benefited from this relationship, but that's really after the fact, after she's lodged this civil suit. And also she was helped career-wise. But I think the government did a good job rehabilitating Cassie, kind of demonstrating, well, you say she did well career-wise, but didn't she go to a movie premiere with a black eye? Didn't they have to put a bunch of makeup? And where would she have been in her career if Combs wasn't the one pulling the strings? So I think there is less doubt as to Cassie because I think the evidence as to Cassie was far more compelling. That's not to say it's a slam dunk, but from everything I have seen, from my personal experience presenting cases to juries who are bringing in their own life experience into the courtroom, I think it's going to be harder to make that determination as to Cassie as it is to Jane.
Why didn't the defense put on a defense?
My personal opinion, and now I practice as a defense attorney, I think it's because they didn't have to. I think at this stage, with how the evidence came in, their cross was very effective. And remember, it only takes one to hang. That's what we say on the defense side, which means all you need is one juror who is a holdout, who is not going to vote to convict, and you get a mistrial. So obviously, the outcomes of a case for a criminal defendant, you want a straight acquittal on all charges. That's the best outcome. The next outcome would be a mistrial, because then the government has to retry the case. Cases do not get better with time. Witnesses have already testified, and this was a long trial. So they're more likely to say something inconsistent on the stand the next time around, which will make it easier to make them seem incredible. Sometimes witnesses don't come back to trial, so it's harder for the government to prove the case. You have a better shot of getting your client out of jail pending the retrial. Combs has been in jail since September of 2024. So that's another potential outcome for them. And then, of course, there's a split verdict, guilty as to something, mistrial, acquittal as to the other. So I think the defense looked at how the evidence came in and really weighed the benefit of putting on their own evidence. They got a lot of what they needed to get out through the government witnesses, through the cross-exam. Text messages, for instance, all of those text messages from Jane that seem to point to a consenting relationship, of Jane setting up these freak offs, of Jane saying or hotel nights, as she called them, have Jane saying she wanted to have hotel nights. They already got that out through the government witness. Why put their own human beings on the stand who will, on direct, when the defense is asking them questions, will say things that are helpful for the defense, but then if the government gets up and has an opportunity to cross them, could potentially undermine their case. So they probably did, they did an assessment and they thought, you know what, we think we can rest on reasonable doubt. There is enough reasonable doubt here that it's probably better for us not to put any witnesses up that could then undermine all of this wonderful doubt we have sowed through this effective cross. Now, that being said, I do want to make one point. Combs has facing 5 charges. That's 1 count of RICO conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking, and then 2 counts of the prostitution, transportation, or the Mann Act violations. I do think the government has proved all day the Mann Act. So I think Combs is going to be convicted of the Mann Act. I think that's very clear. So I just want to be clear that what I am discussing is the RICO and the sex trafficking, because there really isn't a ton of reasonable doubt as to the transportation to engage in prostitution charges. I'm sure they'll say, well, it was Cassie and it was Jane who transported these prostitutes, but the money was coming from Combs. There's no doubt Combs was in the room watching the freak-offs. We all know. I don't think there's going to be a problem convicting him on those counts. So I'm only talking about the 2 lead charges.
Why didn't Combs testify?
Oh, way too risky. I mean, come on. When your defense opens that you're a jerk, I mean, that's what they said. He's a jerk. He's done terrible things. Really risky to put that guy on the stand. I mean, he's not particularly, first of all, he's not particularly likable, right? Like, even his public persona, I remember as a kid growing up in the 90s and going to the 2000s, you'd see Sean Combs, you'd think, that guy's kind of arrogant. Like, he put out good music, but he's not this person that I could see would just be able to win over a jury. I mean, maybe these women, but so number one, that was going to be problematic. Number 2, he would get his side of the story out for sure, consensual, all of the wonderful things he did, but the government, I'm sure, was just champing at the bit to cross him. There is probably evidence out there that was deemed inadmissible. That means it could not be presented in the first instance in the government's affirmative case, that could be admitted if Combs said certain things. We call that opening the door. For someone like Combs, who's facing such serious charges, and this is why most defendants do not testify in their defense, you do not want to open the door for more of that evidence that's going to impeach you and make you look worse, and really undermine your case. Really, really dangerous gamble to put a defendant on the stand. Usually, we only do it in cases where you have to. I remember as a prosecutor in self-defense cases, we would actually structure our case in chief to force the defendant to testify. We would not elicit any testimony about mutual combat where the defense would be able to ask questions about whether or not the defendant was defending themselves. We'd say, force them to testify, get up on the stand, because we knew once they testified, you could get into their motive. How did you feel about this? They're on the stand. They swore an oath to tell the truth. So it just would not have gone well for Combs. And because there was too much risk that the government would do damage, his demeanor, who knows, he might have blown up. We don't know if he'd be able to hold it together. We don't know what evidence they'd be able to get in if he testified. And because their cross was so effective, that risk-benefit analysis, why put your client up to that with all that risk when you can just say to the jury, we don't have the burden here. This is not our burden. The government has a high burden. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. And ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, we've been listening to the same trial for over a month. Government simply has not met it. Reasonable doubt all day. I think that is a very tried and true strategy. And I think especially here, where think about the predicate offenses, forced labor, drug distribution. Do you really want the guy who's being alleged to be at the top up on the stand open to all of that cross? As a defense attorney, I certainly wouldn't have.
Alyse, is there anything else that you think our viewers would want to know about the trial that we haven't already discussed that you'd like to share?
Just that this was just a very novel way to use the RICO charge in general. We've seen the government using the RICO charge in these different types of cases very recently. I'm thinking about R. Kelly, who was actually convicted under RICO, under similar theories, but the evidence was a lot stronger. They were very young women, and there wasn't so much of this consensual back and forth relationship. It was a little bit clearer that these folks were truly trafficked. But the RICO was used by Rudy Giuliani to take down the mob. I mean, that was really how this was engineered to make sure that prosecutors were able to get those people sitting at the tippy top of really sophisticated organizations where low-level people were committing all the crimes and shielding the masterminds of criminal liability. And here we have a mastermind, which is Sean Combs, for sure. I mean, obviously what he's doing is illegal. It's just, was this the right way to charge him is the question. I don't think, is he doing things legally? I don't think that's really a question. But then you have Sean Combs, who's the mastermind and the master conductor and really the actor in all these things. And then you have these really low-level people who are doing these really low-level crimes sporadically. And it just doesn't seem to fit with the intent behind the statute. The writers of the statute, when Congress passed this, this wasn't what they were imagining. And so I think a lot of us are watching to see what the outcome of this case is, to understand the longer term implications. Are prosecutors going to continue to try to take down rich, powerful people who are typically shielded from criminal liability by their underlings, or are they going to have to find another hook to get them? Because ultimately, this is my opinion, what this case is really about is the fact that Combs was able to buy silence for so long that the statute of limitations ran on the obvious crimes. And that is the problem. When you have power, money, and influence, you are able to buy security and silence until it is too late. And that is why prosecutors are forced to use these statutes, which are able to look back, decades if certain things are true, and bring people to justice. But when you are using statutes in a way that they weren't necessarily written or drafted for or contemplated to do, you run into some of the issues that we saw in this case.
Alyse Adamson, former assistant U.S. attorney, thanks for being here. We appreciate your time. Joining me now is Germania Rodriguez, Chief U.S. Reporter at the Daily Mail. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invite, Kelly. Excited to discuss this trial.
And there's a lot of exciting things to discuss. You've written a lot about Diddy's courtroom interaction, trying to allegedly influence the trial, watching the freak off videos, watching the jury's interaction. What are some of your thoughts about all this?
Kelly, that has been one of the most interesting things about this trial. And really, in order to analyze this, we have to remember who Diddy was and how he made his name. Diddy became famous from his college days for throwing the best parties, having the best networking, and being able to develop talent by kind of being someone who make them feel better about their talent, about their abilities. And that's exactly what Diddy is doing in this trial. Of course, we're seeing a different look. It's not the bad boy president look that we used to see at the Met Gala, where he would wear long capes. We're actually seeing something that some analysts call the nerd defense. He's been wearing little knitted sweaters. He's wearing glasses. He has gray hair, just looking like a very non-intimidating person. But not only that, he even received a warning from the judge because he had been trying to make eye contact with the jury. Again, Diddy is someone who is where he is financially because of his charisma and his ability to kind of get into this high-end socioeconomic world. And he's definitely trying to, in any way that he can, connect with the jury, to the point that the judge warned his lawyers if he saw him trying to make eye contact with the jury again, he could even kick him out of his own trial. And again, this is a famous person who many in the jury said they knew. So this is a clear attempt, as the judge said, to influence the jury. We also have seen Diddy bringing different self-help books every day. You know, how to be a better person, how to stay calm among the storm. Again, trying to portray himself as anything but the violent person that the prosecution witnesses have been describing. Also, he's been putting on the Riz in many other ways. He has come out, every time he comes out, he puts a heart out for the sketch artist to draw. That is not the Diddy that these witnesses have described. Again, at one point, he even turned to the gallery and kind of said, like, how are we all doing? Again, like, you know, he is here leading some sort of social gathering. He has asked journalists, how are you doing today? Just this week, actually, the judge, Diddy told the court that he was not going to testify. The judge asked him something like, how are you doing? And Diddy said something back to him to the effect of, I've been wanting to tell you that you've been doing such a good job as the judge of this trial. So again, trying to appear like a friendly, loving guy, but at the same time, you know, retain that mogul status and respect in a sense amongst the gallery.
So, do you think that Diddy work with someone, whether it's a consultant to help prepare him on how to act in front of the jury, or do you think that's part of who he is? Do you think that was discussed with his defense counsel? What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's both. Like I mentioned before, Diddy rose in the world of entertainment because of that charisma. He was able to become close to people who had talent, like Mary J. Blige, Biggie Smalls, and develop that talent, convince them to sign to his label that at the time was not a big label. So that is Diddy's talent, charisma, and get others to see the world how he sees it. That's on one side. On the other side, 1,000%, he received advising, especially in the terms of his outfits, the little sweaters. Actually, the nerd defense that I mentioned, the term was coined by Diddy's one-time lawyer, the guy who defended him he had another trial about where he shot, he was acquitted, but he was accused of shooting someone in a nightclub. And it was his lawyer at that time who coined the term the nerd defense. Get the jury to see you as someone who they just cannot imagine doing the horrific things that the witnesses on the stand are describing.
So, the nerd defense, is it working? Did it work? What are your thoughts on that?
This is going to be a really complicated case. And that is a question. Did this nerd defense work? It's going to be at the center of what the jury does, because it really could go either way. And it's going to be a question of does the jury believe, one, if the victims were agreeing to this freak offs, if there was consent, and two, can they imagine Diddy, this guy they've seen in front of him, who many of the witnesses, after describing him as violent, have said they still like him, they still love him. So I'm not sure if the jury is buying it, but I think they could be.
I mean, how does the jury have that reckoning? As you said, you have the video that CNN came out with where he is harming his former girlfriend, and then, as you said, people have said that they, love him and all that. How do they balance that between what they kind of see and hear about Diddy?
Mhm. That's why one of the strongest evidence that the prosecution has put forward, of course, is the horrific assault video of Cassie in 2016 that we have all seen. That is really the strongest evidence I think the jury has seen, that the guy who seems so nice and loving sitting in front of you can actually be brutally violent. That's the only, physical, visual evidence that they have. So I think most people would be able to kind of understand, he's an artist, he could be putting up a show as he sits in front of us, because they have seen him so brutally assault Cassie. So in that sense, I do think it's very possible that the jury could look beyond this nerd defense. But I think that video is fundamental for that argument that the prosecution is making. In terms of, the issue of consent, that's why the expert on why victims may say, why Cassie and Jane might have sent texts saying, I want to freak off every day of my life, why they might have said that, even if they didn't mean it. And that's going to be another crucial thing that's going to decide the case. What the jury understands about, victim reaction, and why they might have said things they didn't mean, and their victims, even though the defense has shown this text of both alleged victims saying, appearing to consent to these events.
You talked about the nerd defense of Diddy and how his demeanor is, and giving people hugs and looking at the jury.
That's important, by the like, as I've been saying, the hugs are crucial, because as I said, he made a name for himself as a motivator. The witnesses have described him as a motivator, and he has been doing that with his lawyers. If you see the court sketches, he hugs them when he comes in. He's like, good job. He's like coaching them. Um,
So we talk about the nerd defense of Diddy and how he's having this image perceived of hugging his attorneys, doing these hearts, wearing the clothing. If he had all that, then why did he not take the
uh-huh.
witness stand and testify in his own defense?
Yeah, I mean, that actually makes it was the most predictable outcome. Like, most defense lawyers in this case would advise their client to not testify. And that's because it can open up the way for a lot of things, because it's not only, as we know, him sitting there and his lawyers directing the conversation as they want it to go. Then he's going to have to face prosecutors too. And Diddy, despite the nerd defense, if we are to believe people who have taken the stand, is a guy who can lose his temper pretty quickly, if we are to believe what witnesses have said. It's a guy that one moment he can be charming, a motivator, and the other moment you say the wrong thing and you see a different side of him. I think that's another reason, aside from the obvious, that the defense base mostly will advise their clients not to testify, but that's what it is. You do not want to be the prosecution any room to trigger him, to offer evidence that they have not until this point been able to bring. If Diddy were to mention something that's not in evidence right now, it could open then for the prosecution to bring more evidence. It's just kind of like a minefield. So it makes sense that his lawyers would advise him not to. Now, I will say Diddy is someone who trusts his charisma. So I can see a situation where he was wanting to testify and had to be kind of convinced not to. But again, this guy's a smart guy. like rose from the bottom, understands the world of business. I think he understands there are times to listen to his lawyers, and this was one of them.
So talk about the nerd defense. Do you think it's going to work on the jury? Do you believe that they're going to find him guilty or not guilty of the charges?
I think the nerd defense will not play as heavy a role in the jury deliberation as the technicalities of the charges that he is accused of. Again, it's not domestic violence, it's not rape, it's not drugs. And that's what his brilliant team of lawyers have been saying the whole time. Yeah, he has slapped women. Yes, he's a drug addict, terrible boss. He's done terrible things in his life, but he's not a sex trafficker. He's not a racketeer. And I think the jury's understanding of the nuances of those federal charges, as well as I mentioned, trauma response, why a victim might have said one thing when she really didn't mean it, the jury's understanding of that. That's going to be crucial to this case. The issue of consent and whether the jurors believe Cassie and Jane really were consenting at that time to these freak offs or not. I think that's going to be the key between guilty or not guilty.
You spoke a lot about the witness Jane, who's going under a pseudonym, so we don't know who she is, but we know that she's a former girlfriend of Diddy in your Daily Mail's podcast episode, and the ongoing dynamics between her and Diddy. Tell us about that.
And that goes to, again, how the jury will see this. Because Jane is saying she's a victim of sex trafficking, but she said on the stand she still loves Diddy. She said he still pays her rent. She hugged his lawyer after his lawyer was done cross-examining her. So exactly, how is the jury gonna put all of this together? She talked about the good times when she would rub his feet, bathe him. They would watch his favorite show, Dateline, for hours. They appear to be flirting with each other at one point. So to go back to your previous question, how will the jury take this?
So she's on the witness stand flirting with Diddy.
Yeah, she was they were both smiling as she recalled laying in bed, cuddling, watching Dateline, her rubbing his feet. I think at one point she said something like, "That's my baby, like I just wanted to take care of him." And again, he is still paying her rent. One of her arguments of why she said she liked free golfs and continued to engage in them was because she was afraid. At this point, she relied on him financially, and she was afraid if she did not do as he said, she would lose her home. Well, he's still paying her rent from prison. So again, these are the things that if I was the defense, and is what the defense did, they highlighted. And they seem to think they rested their case just after 26 minutes. So that could be an inclination of they feel the state has not proved these federal charges that have a really high standard. Again, he's not accused of domestic violence, rape, drugs, being a bad guy. That has been proven. That has been admitted by the defense. It's sex trafficking, which has a whole other it has a way higher standard to fill. And I do think there will be a prediction. Of course, this is all me having predictions from what I've seen. I don't know what's actually going to go in the jury room, but I totally see that being a discussion. You know, one juror saying, "But she says she loves him. He's still paying her rent." I think those conversations are going to be part of these deliberations.
So I'm fascinated with jury deliberations. And what else do you think is going behind closed doors when the jurors, for the first time, talk about the Diddy cases and the charge? What do you think they're asking each other? What do you think they're saying? What are they focusing on in regards to the evidence?
We hope they make a Ryan Murphy series about this, first of all. And once the case is done and the jurors tell us, because it has to be so interesting. I think a lot of it, I'm predicting that they're going to have a lot of legal questions. Again, these are charges that not everyone understands. What is racketeering? You know, not every citizen understands what considers racketeering. I think they are going to ask for a lot of clarification about sex trafficking, the difference, between sex trafficking, just and like what makes domestic violence different than what happened to Cassie, for example, because we have the video, but that shows domestic violence, which is not what he's charged with. So I think they're going to be having doubts about what every legal term means: racketeering, sex trafficking, and again, the issue of consent. I think they're going to want to go through, the prosecution had an expert, it was actually the same expert that testified in Amber Heard's trial, to explain victim response, PTSD, memory, why victims might recall things differently at different times, why they might disassociate. So again, I think a lot of the conversation is going to be, I think probably part of the jury is going to have more knowledge about, PTSD, victim response, and you might have other people who will be like, but what do you mean? She said she loved free calls. It's as easy as that. I think that's going to be a debate.
So we're talking about the different testimony. Let's talk about Mia. Mia is, of course, going under an assumed name. She's a former assistant who claims to have been sexually assaulted by Diddy multiple times. And her tough cross-examination by Diddy's attorney. What are your thoughts on that?
It was tough. And that's another time that we saw Diddy very pleased with his lawyers, telling them, good job being that motivator. Um, Talking about what the jury is going to be talking about, Mia is going to be part of this, because what the defense did after Mia said, she had been raped, she had been intimidated, her career was derailed. What did Diddy's defense do in cross-examination? Okay, but here, 3 years after you said you were raped, you built an album for him saying he was the nicest guy in the world and thank God for everything he's done for you and that you love him so much. Why did you write that on Instagram if he had raped you several times? So again, what is the jury going to understand from this? Are they going to believe the expert that the prosecution put on the stand saying this is totally normal? Victims act this way. Or are we going to have other jurors who are not going to believe what Mia said because they have seen these texts of her praising Diddy after he allegedly repeatedly sexually assaulted her and abused her in all types of way? I mean, Mia really said that she was kind of under forced labor for the entire time that she worked for Diddy. Then again, I'm sure some jurors are going to be a bit hung up on, why did you for years and years after that continue to say you loved him and he was the best boss ever?
So it's really going to come down to credibility when you look at it from that standpoint. Who is more credible? Is it going to be the witness, or as you say, is that nerd defense going to work out for him? All in all, what are your thoughts on that?
They really think, well, we have to remember Diddy's charged with 5 things. Of course, the most serious that could get him to spend the rest of his life in prison are conspiracy to commit racketeering. That's the most serious one. That means, he was the head of a criminal enterprise controlling all these people to arrange his freak-offs and other criminal activity. Um, and sex trafficking, 2 counts, Jane and Cassie. Those charges, the most important ones, I really think could go either way as of now. I think clearly the defense believes the state has not proven their case. And that's why they only spent 26 minutes in their case, basically saying they haven't proven anything. However, he's also charged with transportation to engage in prostitution. And that I have been proven. I mean, we have records, the text messages, getting the male escorts. Can you get here? Okay, contact my travel attorney, my travel agent. I do think that's a more easy conviction, but that's only a maximum of 10 years in prison. But I do think it's likely that that would go the guilty way. We have seen that he hired male prostitutes and he flew them around the country and the world for these freak offs.
So, what do you think was the most important testimony of the whole case and why?
Cassie, as of course, the prosecution knew it. That's why they started with her. That's why they spent the longest time on her. And Cassie is the victim in this video that I keep talking about because that is the most important piece of evidence for the prosecution. In fact, the defense spent so much energy trying to get this video out of evidence, saying, you know, the video looks like it was edited, it's sketchy. They did everything they could, including talking about jury deliberations. They really did not want this video to be part of the evidence the jury can rewatch once they're in deliberations. They understand that this is really, really bad for the defense. Cassie, there's a lot of reasons why she was such an important witness. She is very charismatic. She is soft spoken. She was 8.5 months pregnant. She gave birth shortly after being on the stand. All of these things make her someone that people can find endearing. Also, the level of domestic violence that was involved in this relationship. It's different than with Jane. Jane herself said that Diddy was only physically violent towards her once, and it was after Cassie filed her lawsuit. But people, witnesses, it's undeniable that Diddy was very, very physically abusive of Cassie. We saw pictures, we saw videos, we saw text messages where she tells him, you know, I'm not a rag doll, I'm somebody's daughter. I think it's undeniable that she was a victim of really intense domestic violence. And now it's up to the jury to see how that might be involved with why Cassie said again that she loved freak-offs because she was constantly being physically abused by this person that has so much more power than her. So I think really another what might, if I had to guess, that charge of sex trafficking for Cassie is way stronger than the sex trafficking charge for Jane.
What else do you think the viewers should know or want to know about the Diddy trial?
Let's see. It's interesting. We need to again go back to who Diddy was in the entertainment industry. We have an ongoing list at the Daily Mail of all the celebrities mentioned in this trial. I mean, Diddy was the guy in the Hamptons who was hanging out with everyone, helping people's careers. And so we have heard mention of, you know, Machine Gun Kelly, Jay-Z, um, a mysterious rapper that allegedly also engaged in freak-offs, but we don't know who it is because the judge said he was not to be named. Um, so how much of this is part of a celebrity lifestyle, you know, the bad boy persona? And why haven't people like Mary J. Blige, Machine Gun Kelly, they have never said Usher, they have not spoken about the charges against Diddy. What did they see? What did they know? Are they going to say anything after a conviction? I think that's really, really fascinating. And also, this debauchery. The defense has been kind of saying he's a rich guy. They're all doing that. How much is that true versus sex trafficking? Again, these are complex things that most citizens are. There are legal terms. You know, the lawyers are saying this is just his king. Is everyone involved in this? The defense really wanted part of Jane's testimony. She said Diddy became mad at her because she was present in another rapper's freak off. Clearly, the defense wanted to make it seem like this is just part of the lifestyle. I thought that was really, really fascinating. And I want to see what other celebrities have anything to say about this. What if Diddy is acquitted? Will they come out and defend him then? What will happen then? This is really a huge possibility in this case. So that's really an interesting part of this. The celebrity world, the other celebrities that were involved in this. We saw Kanye West showed up to support Diddy. So I remember before the trial started, a lot of people thought it was gonna be, you know, sort of like a Jeffrey Epstein thing. Like there was gonna be a list of what celebrities participated in this freak offs. The trial showed it was not that type of situation. It's not that at the white parties all the celebrities were participating in the freak offs. That's not the case. But what did they know? We've heard mention of very powerful people. For example, Jimmy Iovine, the co-founder of Interscope Records. We heard he was there, present when when Diddy assaulted Cassie at a dinner. We heard from Capricorn Clark that she had a meeting with Jimmy Iovine and he told her, leave Diddy alone or you'll never work in this industry again. What about that? Jimmy Iovine is still a very important person in the music industry. Also, two people, Christina Koram, Diddy's chief of staff, right-hand woman, and D-Rock, another handwrite person. They have not appeared in the trial. They have been mentioned by every person, basically, as people who helped Diddy cover up the video of the Cassie assault, people who would text Cassie when she wanted to leave to say, hey, it's fine, I'll talk to him, come back. Where are these two characters? Will they face charges? Because they really do talk about the racketeering charges. They appear to be the two alleged henchmen and women that were really working for Diddy to hide his alleged criminal activity and get these victims to get back with him. So overall, I've said a lot, but I think Christina Koram and D-Rock, where are they? Will they face consequences? Were they subpoenaed? Have they pled the fifth? Have they been working with prosecutors? There's a lot of mystery around those two characters who witnesses have said were helping Diddy abuse these women.
How do you think this trial has affected or will affect the music industry?
Oh my goodness. I think we're already post Me Too. So I think the music industry has already changed a lot. I mean, a lot of the things that people now say, look at that debauchery that was like out in the open for everyone to see. We have to remember that pre-Me Too, this was the hip hop world, and they would post images, partying with three women. Diddy was not hiding this lifestyle. We have interviews where Diddy is bragging to Ellen DeGeneres that he was just having sex for 48 hours. This was part of his persona. Um, I think this will no longer be part of the rapper persona. I think we're gonna have, it's I don't know if you've seen 50 Cent's commentary in all of this, but 50 Cent must be squeaky clean because he's been out here trolling trolling Diddy, and really, there's not any sort of accusations against 50 Cent to that extent. He's now a businessman. He just produced a crime documentary. I think that's what we're going to see rappers be like now. Instead of, again, we have to remember where Diddy comes from. The days of Tupac and Biggie, where they were in their rap songs threatening each other. In this trial, we heard one situation where one of D-Rock actually saw Suge Knight at a diner in LA. And he called Diddy and tells him, Suge Knight is here. And, the jury heard they picked up a bunch of guns and they just took a car immediately to try to confront Suge Knight. This is the hip hop world of the 90s and early 2000s. You can't do that anymore. So I think this might be the last of that culture where these, it was, you were supposed to be a bad boy to be a rapper. They're not like that anymore. You even look at Machine Gun Kelly, an artist that was developed by Diddy. He talks about feminism. He talks about, being nice to women. Yeah, that's, you can't be bragging about, being mean to women anymore.
Thank you, Germania Rodriguez, Chief U.S. Reporter at the Daily Mail. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Kelly.
Thanks for watching Unresolved: The Diddy Cases. Stay tuned for more episodes.